Stephen is the emeritus professor of Jewish communal studies at Hebrew Union College, and and this is taken from his website, which I recommend to you, called thewindreport.com. And he's a leading expert on the subject of Jewish politics and the author of several articles, many articles, not just several, publications and books, which include Quest for Power, a study in Jewish political behavior and practice, published in 2014. And I just want to mention that one of his earliest books with, many of us knew the late Professor Jerry Bubis, who was also a mentor and a dear friend. Stephen and Jerry published this little booklet in 2005 called From Predictability to Chaos, How Jewish Leaders Reinvented Their National Communal System. If you remember, there were three major national organizations in America: the Council of Jewish Federations, CJF, which was the earliest of them, and then the UJA, the United Jewish Appeal, and the United Israel Appeal. I won't go into each of them and what they did, but at some point they formed a merger into what was originally called the United Jewish Communities. Today has morphed into, after I think one other transition, to JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America. This was a book that where Stephen and Jerry interviewed a lot of people, and it was I think a positive yet critical analysis of that merger. And I just, in keeping with our subject this morning, I picked it off my bookshelf, and I just wanted to relate one factor. And part of their table of contents, if you go down that table of contents, you will see two chapters, small chapters, called The Perceived Losers and the Winners. So if I reviewed that, and I wanted to know where Israel was, loser or winner. And as I felt then, you said then, in terms of your study with Jerry, Alav Shalom, and I'm only going to pick out a couple of sentences. In the view of some, the UJC, United Jewish Communities, the merged organization of the three entities, will not be a strong enough national instrument with sufficient power to balance local needs and international priorities. A related question involved those local federations which have expanded their own operations in Israel, bypassing the UJC altogether. Meanwhile, the increased frequency of directed giving by large donors might ultimately weaken the capacity of this new system to achieve its core objectives. I have a point of view that I felt then and feel more strongly today, that prediction, Davka, all came to be. And where I go with that is that, hi Dan, I want to welcome Dan Diker, the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I thought you were in England, or you're leaving today?
I felt I was in England. That's why I was a little late. I thought I was in London.
Well, welcome.
Leaving tomorrow.
Okay, I'm glad you're here. Hi, Tirza. And Tirza, who
Sure.
One of our researchers here at the center. Welcome. We're glad you're both here. I went back and found one of the articles, which you will find on Steve's website. Do you know one another, by the way? Dan? Stephen? You know one. Okay, good. Back, a piece that you wrote in the Times of Israel in January 2023, The Idea of Diaspora, Its Distinctive Role in Transnational Politics. And picking out one sentence again, it's cherry picking, I admit that, but it ties into the subject this morning. That one sentence is the last sentence, the concluding sentence. The particular characteristics of the Israel-diaspora relationship most certainly continue to take on new dimensions of study as the State of Israel moves in its 75th year, which we recently celebrated, as you all know, from its nation-building phase to its more established and recognized status within the international community. So then I would now say, Stephen, our topic this morning, which you provided to us, is managing the Israel-American Jewish relationship. Where do we go from here? So as we move to that established and recognized status within the international community, where do we go from here? Bavakasha.
Thank you, Howard, and good morning to all of you, and thank you for taking time from your schedules to join me, and to my former students, to my colleagues, and to the Institute itself. I'm most appreciative, and to the memory and meaning of Dan Elazar in the work that I do, because Dan so inspired and engaged with Jerry and myself in so many different ways. I'm most grateful. So where do we go from here? I mean, I think this is an extraordinary moment in the diaspora-Israel connection, and it is one that is certainly not totally unique. In looking at Jewish history, I'm reminded of the fact that even during the period of the Second Temple, there were extraordinary tensions between diaspora communities and Jerusalem. And it struck me that in studying some of those models, we may draw some inspiration or at least some insight into where and what we might better understand this current framework. So let's move ahead to our study. I tried to date, and this is very arbitrary, sort of the evolution and development of this pattern of relationships, because it is not static and it is continuously transitioning. And by the way, these slides are available to you should you wish to use them or challenge them. But they provide by providing a kind of periodic perspective, it gives some idea to the nature of a evolving and changing construct. And the importance of that is that both those who were the builders of Zion and those who were outside of this experiment needed time to digest the implications of this moment. And what's particularly fascinating is to realize that even during the periods of the evolution of the state, there were huge places of opposition to the whole idea of the Zionist experiment. I, for one, grew up in a congregation in the South that was an American Council for Judaism congregation. So you can imagine how old I am, but also how that sort of positions me.
Better explain that.
American Council for Judaism believed very firmly that America is our Zion, Judaism is our religion, and that there is no place in the American Jewish construct for a Jewish national homeland. So that meant that the Israeli flag could not be on the bima. It implied that Hebrew was a secondary, marginal aspect to one's Jewish educational journey. And it suggested that why would a young man such as myself even want a bar mitzvah? Because that was certainly sort of contrary to the notion, since Shabbat was observed on Sundays, because we were like the world of Protestantism in America. So one has to sort of understand that that was where and how I grew to ultimately find my way, thanks to so many wonderful friends and scholars and teachers who helped introduce me to the richness of Judaism, Zionism, and the cultural components of an alternative way of examining the relationship to Israel. So we can move forward.
Question?
Yeah.
Why 1891? What happened then?
Well, I think I took that from some of the early Zionist writings as a sort of framing the conversation as the basis for moving that forward. I mean, I think we connect to Israel and understand it through different lenses, and part of that is certainly historic connections of how people sort of relate to the Zionist Israel story through these paradigms of historic moments. And yet others relate to it symbolically through the imagery of particular moments or of particular themes that are powerful to them and their connections to how they see Israel and the Zionist experiment. And certainly certain cultural messaging, whether it's the use of language or its particular symbols or its particular concepts related to how Israel is brought into the American story. And most clearly the political moments, those times in which Israel is challenged, where the relationship itself is critically in play. Let's move to the next slide. I mean, I think where we are today is confronting a series of very particular transitions or changes in the relationship. Generations are significant, and we now see that in the data about younger American Jews in particular. The Pew studies and most of our community studies specifically reference the distinctive differences that younger Jews have in connection to Israel, their sense of responsibility, their understanding of its place in history, their notions about how they relate personally through their own identity connections. And clearly what we see in the United States among all liberal religious expressions, Jewish, Protestant, and otherwise, is the rise of a very distinctive group of folks who call themselves religious nuns, none of the above. And that cohort is particularly problematic when we come to the topic of how they feel some identity or connection or loyalty to the Jewish state. And if a third of young American Jews hold such a view, which is what Pew and others indicate, it reminds us that that is a significant challenge because they do not have those institutional connections to either synagogues or JCCs or federations or other institutional outlets by which they can, in a sense, frame or reclaim a kind of connection to the Zionist and Israel story. And so that becomes maybe our largest challenge in terms of this generational picture. And certainly the policy issues. As American Jews look at Israel as a kind of particular area of interest and relationship, when there are policy questions where they struggle with those outcomes and the decisions made in Jerusalem, they clearly face a unique barrier in a sense as to how they feel about the state, how they engage with the idea of Israel, and how they move forward in terms of sharing their concerns and their passions with fellow citizens and cohorts. Because I think it's distinctive that these issues drive conversations, also drive divisions, and create the tensions that we currently see in the American Jewish community. And what we are seeing at American universities today is an effort to redefine the sort of place of Jews, Judaism, and Israel in the conversation around who's in and who's out in the political spectrum. We'll get more into that in a moment. But the implication of that is that Israel and Jews are outliers, meaning that we are no longer seen as part of the core construct of what America might need to look like, of what American society ought to be emphasizing. And that is particularly challenging for young Jews in a classroom where they are told that they are, in some measure, either non-white or they are too white. Too white in the sense that they are too establishment, too close to the political and economic elites of the society, or that they are non-white in the sense that they are no longer a minority and that they are seen as part of a kind of majoritarian culture. The next slide, please. So here the data taken from Pew reflects some of the realities of what we are seeing on the ground. the divergence and clear differences between those who are more engaged religiously or more involved politically with a particular perspective, and how that plays out, where both politics and religion are two criteria by which we can measure how Jews are connected or declining in that sense of connection to the state of Israel. So that being a Reform or conservative Jew is less likely for one to be necessarily engaged and is intensively involved in Israel as would be a more traditional Jew. And likewise, Jews separated from all religious life, even less involved and less connected. The next slide, please. I think it's also imperative to understand that while there is an overwhelming interest in Israel, the sense of engagement with the issues of Israel, that should not necessarily imply that American Jews at large, as a whole, are intensively committed to all of the directions, policies, and goals that the state of Israel and its government may be projecting. And that certainly has created this significant challenge in the most recent issues that we are contending with.
Steve, is it Pew?
Yes, all of this data is Pew-based. Yeah. And likewise with travel, I think sometimes we misread that the fact that almost 50% of American Jews have experienced Israel somehow implies a kind of intentionality in terms of their understanding and engagement. One of the most interesting components of my work on my book on Donald Trump and his impact on American Jews in Israel was that we found that for most American Jews, Israel was only the 4th to the 7th most important issue in their voting patterns. Now, surely for those Jews who, and we'll look at the data about intensity of Republican Jewish voting patterns, which far more pro-Israel and far more committed to a kind of Israel first agenda. The bulk of American Jews have a tendency to see Israel as important but not critical to their outcomes as voters. And therefore, in the rankings of what constitutes concerns for American Jews, questions related to immigration, education, patterns related to social security and health care are far higher issues of priority to American Jews than the security and status of Israel. The next slide, please. So, I mean, this particular data simply confirms what we have understood, which is the disconnect between older and younger Jews, sort of reaffirming some of the considerations as to why we are in a kind of transitional moment in terms of being able to define and articulate what we are likely to see moving forward. Let's move on. These three themes, which are found in universities today, are particularly significant because in a kind of postmodernist mindset, what we are seeing is such things as intersectionality, which suggests that if you are a victim or you are persecuted or you are a minority, you share or intersect with other groups, similar conditions or situations. But if you don't place Jews in this sort of construct, you find that the Jewish student sits outside of that frame and is not seen as part of the communities of disconnect from power or part of communities that are vying for particular or equal status. And I think this is a part of the larger picture associated with the notions that Israel is now classified as colonialist, as against being aspirational as nation building. And as a result, the dynamics of that situation create this divide between how Jews are perceived and how Jews see themselves. The dynamics here also, which I spoke about, of hyper-white, is reflected again in some of these themes of how the mindset of Western intellectual thought today in the United States has really shifted away from a kind of liberal perspective of conversations about Jews as contributors to and part of the evolving mainstream of American ideas, and now seen as a problematic community and outside of the systems of groups that have grievances and feel, in a sense, disconnected or left out from the mainstream of political behavior. And let's move forward. I mean, I think a lot of American Jews have a kind of fantasy image of Israel. It's almost a Disneyland view that this is an exotic place, and as a result they come to it with a perspective that is really not realistic and concrete, and I think that has created over time part of the challenge. It is also reflected in the concept of understanding what Western nation building is like and not realizing that Israel is both Western but also has a huge influx and influence of Eastern and other cultures, and as a result is much more complicated than simply a traditional Western model of democracies and liberalism. And that too seems to compete with the ideas of how people understand Israel and skew their thinking about what it may be to be in connection with or in dialogue with Israel. And I think what I've seen with the writings of a number of people, but Gil Troy in particular has done a nice job with his commentary piece in 2018, where he focuses on these sort of misconceptions that American Jews have about Israel and what effect that has on their frustration at times and their lack of understanding of the complexities of living in the Middle East, of dealing with such immense challenges, and understanding the diversities and multicultural pieces to the Israel story. The next slide, please. I mean, I understand that in looking at the political frame that we see, that most American Jews fall into one of these categories. And this may be pretty obvious to you if you study or look at Jewish voting patterns, but this tendency was certainly borne out in the 2016 campaign, and the 2020 campaign is likely to be similar in the 2024 election, where we will have these distinct divides about where Israel fits in the priority of American Jewish voting behavior. And that is particularly significant in really expressing in any kind of public way how Jews really respond to the question of their relationship to Israel and where they place that in the listings or priorities of their voting outcomes. I think that one of the interesting pieces to all of what we are seeing is that in a survey I did of American rabbis from conservative and Reform congregations, more particularly than in the Orthodox world, is that rabbis increasingly are telling me that they are not speaking to the issue of Israel from the pulpit, that it is simply too controversial, and that it is simply part of the larger construct of politics today, where they cannot talk about the American political scene or the Israel political scene.
I think they use the word toxic.
And indeed, a kind of toxic environment in which the pulpit has no longer become a place that is comfortable for the discourse of ideas in around these kinds of themes. And that is a particularly challenging consideration when you realize that many congregants actually want a perspective and need, they feel, their rabbi to, in a sense, either reflect their views or to challenge their perspectives. But that seemingly is a decreasing phenomenon in the American pulpit. And the organizational divisions as well, which you clearly know about, which are fierce and continuous in terms of who is considered pro-Israel and which groups are sort of pilloried as either problematic or non-supporting of Israel. And that too adds another sort of cutting point to the great divide that we see in the American Jewish community of Jews unable to sit down with fellow Jews over Shabbat or at other occasions because the discourse can no longer be political. And when people already have formed their ideas, they, with intent, avoid sitting in those settings, in those kinds of places where they would be forced to confront opponents to their perspective. So the division goes far deeper than simply institutional or rabbinic behaviors. It speaks to the challenges about discourse in the American Jewish context. And many of folks have told me that they have broken friendships over the course of these past number of years, having to do with Israel or American political behavior in one way or another. Next slide, please. So how do we go forward from all of this? And what does this all mean for us? And I think this is an opportunity rather than necessarily a moment to sort of throw up our hands and feel totally, in a sense, frozen and isolated. I mean, I think there's really an opportunity to reframe much of the conversation and the discussion, especially in the fact that American Jews are really interested in conversations that allow them to discuss what they are feeling, but also require a lot of information that they simply are not necessarily being exposed to. Because if one reads only a particular perspective in the press, then you are given already a kind of slanted or defined point of view, as against being able to talk about some of the complexities and diversities that are essential. So the framework of really reframing the debate and the conversation is important. There is an organization called Resetting the Table, which is really fascinating because they are in the business of helping to create constructive Jewish conversations with guidelines and rules as to how that can happen. And that may be a piece to this story that has to grow, training more people who can manage those kinds of discourses and who are in a position to help move the conversations from personal perspectives to a broader understanding of what is collectively in the interests of Jewish peoplehood and of the community. I also have thought about the fact that we have downsized the kind of resources we are expending in the area of Jewish community relations. Once a very vibrant field, this field has taken a kind of back seat. And even our national agencies are focusing much more on very particularized kinds of activities and actions. Yes, fighting anti-Semitism, essential. And dealing with anti-Israel rhetoric, absolutely. But creating conversations and engagement with other communities is a much more challenging task. It's a much more difficult task. And that becomes really a core ingredient to the refocusing of community relations in the arena of intergroup discourse. And that will be particularly significant for a generation that is far less understanding of the historical experience of how this state came into being, or a brief, or even a better understanding of what the challenges are in the Middle East today. So the community relations agenda becomes, I think, a particularly critical piece to the story moving forward. The Los Angeles Jewish community did away in 2007 with its community relations infrastructure. And here in 2023, the Federation is now announcing its plans to reopen or recreate such a structure. you cannot live in a society such as the United States without doing and being committed to this kind of intensive work, and that will be an essential piece to how we move forward. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff coming out of Israel, the sweet spots as I call them, and that often don't get played and don't get recognized, and that element of how we tell those stories, the humanitarian work, the global involvement of the nonprofit sector in serving peoples across the globe, all different aspects of that become really a reminder of the extraordinary story that is the Israel story, which often does not play in the context of how Israel is interpreted in academic circles or in some political venues, which I think is a missed opportunity for all of us. And there is very little knowledge or understanding of the story of Zionism and the historic rise of the state. I mean, that's almost totally absent in the American experience today, and how we figure out ways to explore that is particularly significant in the context that this is a really unique case study of how nation formation takes place, and the kind of cultural, economic, political, and social forms of Zionism that emerged, and the ways in which all of those ideas ultimately led to the creation and framing of a experiment in state building. And that seems to be really something extraordinary, and has been totally sort of left off the pages and formulas of how our youth movements, our schools and curriculum are working. I have a colleague at the college whose field is Israel Studies, and she has designed some extraordinarily creative ways of teaching Israel. But she's one of very few people in the United States who is actually equipped to sort of reinvent the telling of the story and how to deal with the absence of critical responses to people who are coming at our kids in ways that they are not prepared to effectively respond. So there's a lot of work to be done here that specifically focuses on the educational and infrastructural pieces to the Jewish rebuilding of this story. With that, I'm going to welcome your comments and questions and take us wherever you want this conversation to go.
Let me mention, first of all, there's some fruit and grapefruit. There's some kibbutz in the back, and feel free to get up, get some coffee, water, some fruit, cake, whatever, please. I appreciate you guys. I'm going to take the liberty of a first question if I can. You said there are many of the rabbis in the Reform and Conservative movement are afraid to address Israel from the pulpit. One major rabbi recently has been for some time, but blockbuster articles and sermon recently, Amiel Hirsch.
Yes.
Rabbi Hirsch is very, very positive. He can be lovingly critical, but he's very pro-Israel. You're familiar with, and even recently in some work you've done, with some of the major leadership in the Reform movement. How are they, and I recommend that you Google Rabbi Amiel Hirsch and read his, yes. No, he's
Stephen
Reformed.
Wise.
He's Reformed. He's the son of Dick Hirsch, alav shalom. And
The name of this group is Recharging, R-E-charging.
right, but he
Recharging
came
Israel.
out with a major sermon just recently. I recommend that you read it.
What's his name?
Amiel Hirsch, Hirsch. How's it being received by, and his positioning being received by Reform leadership?
Well, Ami convened a conference 2.5 weeks ago in New York which I participated in, called Recharging Reform Judaism. And the first day of this two-day conference was all about rebuilding the reform movement's Israel agenda and strengthening it and growing it, and ended with an announcement that he had secured funding to train young reform rabbis who are just finishing their training for a 5-year intensive program of continued work with Israel and Zionism. This is Ami's reason for convening the Recharging of Reform Judaism was really built around this model, because he was basically concerned that he was worried that the movement is moving away from or distancing itself. Now, Reform Judaism historically has moved in and out of its relationship with Zionism and Israel, but the leadership of the movement would push back, as they did at the conference, that they felt that the movement is committed to and is going to sustain its involvement deeply with Israel. And Ami will certainly continue to carry from the outside in this message. The other purpose for this conference is to really realize that the two major liberal movements in the American context, Reform and Conservative Judaism, are in deep trouble in terms of the declines of membership, the closing of some congregations, some significant challenges in terms of how they position themselves in being able to recruit both future rabbinic students, but more than that, to build their membership base. So it's a particularly challenging moment. But it raises the larger issue of the inside pushback in these two movements and elsewhere of trying to reframe how these institutions see themselves as part of the diaspora Israel story, and how much influence they can bring to bear on issues of concern to them as Masorti and liberal Jews living in diaspora, but having interest in and ties to certainly communities here in Israel.
I just want to introduce Yechiel Leiter, who is the Director General. Welcome, Yechiel, of the JCPA. I saw some hands up. Artie, Richard, we'll go around the table, I promise. Go ahead.
So, with your permission, 2 short questions. Number one, isn't there some sort of intrinsic flaw, for lack of a better term, comparing the state of Israel, the nation of Israel, and the American Jewish community, or any Jewish community in the diaspora? Because Israel could be described as an organic entity, which is natural in that it is a nation state, and the people who live here are all Israelis, not all Jews, but mostly Jews. Whereas in the diaspora, in the United States particularly, Jews live in communities. Even more so, they live within organizations, and their affiliation has to be through the organization. So if they're not organizationally affiliated, they're missing, they're gone, they're disappearing. Here, that's not true. Is there something wrong about comparing the two? It's like apples and oranges. That's question one. Question two is, given the reality, given the passing of the development of the American Jewish community over the last 100 years, there's a schism now. We acknowledge the fact that there's a schism. Okay? Was it inevitable? Given the objectives and goals of American Jewish life over the last century, wasn't the schism, and the goals and views of the purpose of Zionism, wasn't this schism inevitable?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, on the question, these are really two different constructs, there's no question. And the American model is volunteer, it's a volunteer system. It's very much increasingly choice and individuality, as we see by the behaviors of American Jews. And therefore, we have a much more difficult task in many ways to create a consensus and engagement than maybe a nation-state system does. So it is a disconnect between the two.
Is it futile to compare the two, though? I mean,
Yeah.
that's my question. Like,
No,
what's the point?
and diasporas by definition are really communities of interest as against a nation state system. So it is clearly a very different kind of definitional relationship.
Liberty of comment, if you, correct, but if you take the Elazar material as to a Jewish polity,
Yeah.
they come
That would work as it did for Dan in the generations first, second, and third.
Right.
But here we are, fourth and fifth American Jewish generations. And the sovereign self has replaced the collective community. That's principle one. And principle two is that in that collective community, and just take the LA population study of 2022, 1/2 of all Jews of Los Angeles, which is roughly 700,000, 1/2 have no institutional affiliation with any any part of the organized, so-called organized Jewish community. So that itself creates a framework of how do you even address, reach, or connect to a community of folks who are outside of these institutional arrangements.
So that kind of leads to my second question: is so wasn't this inevitable?
So indeed, I think
I
it's
think Daniel Gorda says it wasn't.
yeah, and indeed, even when looking at other diaspora experiences of other peoples, we see this pattern. The article that Howard quoted earlier, my work on looking at other diaspora communities, we see similar patterns of the rise of engagement, the disconnects, at times the reaffirmation of connection, and at other points total separation. So that is conceivable that we are living with that. Yet we note some extraordinary, exciting, and interesting stuff as well. For example, the rise of American Orthodoxy is a phenomenon that we are just beginning to study, and it's really a fascination of the numbers and the growing power and influence of that community will have over the next 30 to 50 years. And by the time we come to 2050, most of the children in the American Jewish educational system will be Orthodox, by far. So we see a shift from sort of, secular and liberal, conservative Jewish students as being dominant to the rise of an Orthodox.
You can see the Klein's
Haredi,
article that you saw
Haredi
post?
In the States, it's a combination of Haredi and modern, for sure. But it's very definitely apparent.
You read Speaker Klein's article in the Jerusalem Post about this?
He wrote about Chabad.
Yeah, well,
Yes,
they're
and
Orthodox.
Chabad is the other piece to that story, of its unique role in the American story and piece as well. And then I would close with the fact that there's also the rise of a whole group of new institutions. One of them is called Heart of a Nation. It's a breakoff from AIPAC, with AIPAC's blessing. It's an effort to reach younger people who are moving into the so-called progressive democratic political wing as a way to re-engage them. Yes, you can be progressive, but you can also be Zionist. And how to build a strategy of going back into that camp. Heart of a Nation. There are several of these groups. I've written about several of them because they're really fascinating. There are efforts to sort of say, yes, we've got a problem, and here are some of the counter components of how we're going to deal with and manage moving forward. Yeah.
Richard.
So your presentation seems to be a transition in terms of the way we've been doing business in America for younger people, for a younger generation, is no longer
Yeah.
the focus. And I think there needs to be another slide because professionally and on a lay leadership level, when I was in the States and when I made Aliyah, I was involved with two organizations that the organized Jewish community recognized were put into place to deal exactly with the challenge that you're focused on. And yet I'm not hearing whether or not the evaluation of the work that's being done with these organizations is effective. So the first is Hillel and the partnership with Birthright. I was a lay leader in Hillel, and we would send hundreds of young people with the idea that it was an anecdote, and that this is really going to help and really solve the problem, because it's going to rekindle the neshama in every Jew, and that they would then, when they came back to Hillel, become involved. That was number one. Number two, when I made Aliyah, I became very involved with Stand With Us. Stand With Us was created exactly for the purpose of which you mentioned was the challenge, that people need to be educated, not only on a college campus, but online, in classrooms, from high school through graduate school. And every birthright group that now comes to Israel visits the education center and receives that kind of educational nourishment. But no one seems to be evaluating whether these organizations are effective and whether the money that's been spent organizationally within the Jewish community and the diaspora, that these are the ways to effectively make sure that we have a future.
So Len Cohen at Brandeis.
Len Sachs.
Len Sachs, sorry. At the Cohen Center, Len has done a number of studies of birthright participants, post-birthright, and over time, trying to sort of assess what happens. And it's a mixed bag, to say the least. He shared with me recently some of that data. It's not all public yet, but it's a complex set of factors, because what a birthright experience is 10 days. And some of these folks come to that experience having grown up, in a kind of totally sort of secular, in a Jewish environment, in a sense where I was surprised to see the number of kids who were reporting that they had Christmas trees, for example, or had Christmas trees and Hanukkah, or had some other sort of shared multi-religious experience as part of their emerging development. So how many of them, after this experience, will sort of move to a more Jewishly based lifestyle and identity? And how many will simply say, this was a great one-off, but there's nothing sustaining there to them or for them? So that's really...
There's a follow-up to birthright, you said, isn't it?
Yes, well, that's also...
And Hillel was supposed to be the receptacle to deal exactly with what you're suggesting, that if it was a one-off, then it was a waste of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have the data.
Even
The data is staring
have
at you,
your
right?
life
But you presented there.
experience of participants in the
You
birthright. Maybe it's
I said,
worthwhile
well-
to hear them.
What?
Maybe it's
I
worthwhile
have a
to
group
hear
of 6
our.
interns
What?
for birthright products.
Howard, if I could just, I mean, the data that you presented up there was quite clear that the more, you just put it down in the bottom line, the more Jewish you are, the more connected you are with Israel, which is why more Orthodox people come to Israel, more Orthodox people are connected to Israel, more Orthodox people are single over to issues. So if you're looking to make people connected with Israel, you make them more Jewish. That's basically what the data says. So all this other data, all these other programs looking to, I mean, it's been going back and forth, like you're saying, all this millions and millions of dollars that have been spent on all these other programs. It's exactly like you said, what do you show for it? There's really little to show for it.
We're caught a little bit in between going around the table and various questions, but also there are comments that I think, from what I understood, some of you who have been part of Birthright and are interns here, give us a couple insights.
Thank you.
And then we'll come back. Elon and Alan will come back to you.
So I did Birthright this summer. What I will say in my experience,
Sorry, can you just say where you're from?
Oh, I'm from Marlborough, Massachusetts. I go to Brandeis University. But so I did Brandeis Birthright, and in my experience, I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood. I was raised Jewish. I went to Jewish sleepaway camp. I get a microphone?
Yeah.
You're
You're a star.
You're going to be on the website.
Testing. Okay. So I grew up in a very Jewish family, and I went to Israel before Birthright. What I noticed Birthright is that, you know, I think a lot of people, you know, they enjoy the experience. I think for me, it was a great chance to be in Israel all over again. I think what a lot of people like is sort of kind of the party life of Israel. I think that was the big attraction for a lot of people. I think in terms of kind of how people take back what they had from Birthright, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think, you know, people who really do take stuff back from Birthright, it's kind of a given before they even step foot in Israel. But I think there's a lot of people who, you know, as you said, don't really take much of an experience. I think for me it was a great experience. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love that free flight. But yes, I think Birthright at least is a good chance for at least us Americans to come see Israel at least once. So thank you. I can pass off to any of the other interns who do Birthright.
Any other comment, Marcus?
Hello, my name is Gabrielle. I go to the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I also just finished a Birthright trip. I actually did my Birthright trip through my Chabad, like it was a Mayamot trip. So it was a little bit more like, I guess, religious than the Hillel trip. And I'm also on like the Chabad board at my university. And one of the challenges that my rabbi was talking to me about was that Birthright is great and it's incredible because it's a free trip to Israel, but one of the biggest issues that we're having at GW is that nearly a third of our population at the university is Jewish, but we can barely fill an entire bus to go on this Birthright trip for a free trip to Israel. So that's one of the biggest issues that we've witnessed with Birthright. But I think, because at our university we have the Hillel Birthright and the Chabad Birthright, and they both witnessed that issue. But speaking on my experience on my Birthright trip, because it was a little bit more religious, like we spent 4 days in Jerusalem. We were here over Shavuot. Like we woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the Kotel on Shavuot. It was an incredible experience. And nothing was forced on anyone. Everyone could choose what they wanted to do and how they wanted to connect. And being on that trip, what I realized, a lot of people didn't grow up in a very like religious community or had a Jewish background, but they were all open to the idea of experiencing something new and, you know, like tapping into that connection. And because the rabbi from my university was on the trip, they were able to ask a bunch of different questions about Judaism and learn more about Judaism. And I feel like that was the main, like, the most important thing about the trip. Yes, coming to Israel and experiencing Israel, but being able to connect to their Judaism in a way that they haven't done previously, I think was one of the bigger highlights of the trip.
Judaism as opposed to Zionism?
Judaism
As opposed to Israel?
Well, in relation, I feel like throughout the trip, when we were talking about Judaism, it was in relation to Zionism and like the state of Israel. Our tour guide, like, whenever he would like talk about Judaism, he would always connect it back to Israel and how this is our state. So I would say in accordance with the two.
Thank you. Coming back to some of the questions, Ilan, you were next, and then Alan.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that there's very little research done on the relationship between American Jewry and Israel. Most of the conversation
Ilan,
is
take the mic.
most of the conversation is usually about the place of Israel in American Jewish life. It's a typical question in surveys, and so, where does Israel fit within the general construct of American Jewish identity? In other words, the relationship between these two categories that Artie before related to, they're very different, but they still have a relationship, was hardly studied. Last year I reread Charles Hoffman's Smokescreen. It was a classical book. Fantastic. I think it's one of the last works and one of the only works that were done. But when there is a conversation about the relationship, not through research but through public discourse, usually it's about institutional relationship, philanthropy, federations, shlichim, and so forth. And that is an interesting topic for maybe 3 people in the world to find out what happened in this relationship over the years, and I think the 3 people are sitting in the room. But I would like to suggest a different perspective on looking at the relationship, and that is much more through sociological categories. And here I would argue, and I've written about it also, but I think that since the mid-1980s, that's the mark, I think, there has been an opening in the relationship between American Jews, not American Jewish institutions, and Israeli Jews on a mass level in ways that we haven't seen before. There was never a relationship before on a sociological level, complete disconnect, only mediated through institutions. But from the 1980s and increasingly, there's a mass level engagement. I'm not talking about the quality of the engagement, but a sort of engagement between masses of Israelis and masses of American Jews through a variety of platforms, of which Birthright is actually a very interesting one. As shallow and problematic as it is, Birthright has, in its mass scale performance, also has developed a mass scale encounter between American Jews and Israelis because of the Israelis who participate on Birthright programs. So far, I think cumulatively, there are about 150,000 young Israelis who went on Birthright because they were invited to join. I don't know if you had them in your groups, but I think it's still being performed. So you have, and if you look at if you cut this cake from this direction, that direction, and you look at Partnership 2000 and school exchanges and many other platforms that I don't have the time to, but I will mention one now. There's now a renaissance in delegations of influential Israelis who travel to the United States to learn about the American Jewish experience. It was started by the American Jewish Committee 20-something years ago, maybe even more, but now it's actually, it's done on not a mass level, but on a very significant level. Today, many people in the public service, in the military, in academia are exposed. So I would, and then if you also talk about cultural exchanges, film and music, and so I would suggest that there's something going on that we don't know how to quantify, and we should pay attention to on the sociological level, and its relationship, very non-regulated relationship. The institutions might be even clueless about what's going on, but I think it's very interesting.
May I just add, the American Jewish Committee has just done a series of studies of Israelis and American Jews in terms of how they see each other. And if you haven't seen that data, it's really quite fascinating.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Where's it going?
Alan.
Thank you. As I look at your slide here, I see that the focus of the strategies for the future is the American Jewish community, whether it's re-establishing Jewish community relations councils or investing further in education. But it seems to me that there is a major target which is not mentioned there, and it's really perhaps the most important institution, not a Jewish institution, but the most important institution that will have a bearing on the future of the currently most vulnerable population in terms of Jewish identity and connection to Israel, namely university students. Now, universities, Jews in the United States have a very high level of participation in tertiary education, and the institution which I think is a major threat to Jewish continuity, to Jewish sense of feeling secure as a Jew, feeling proud as a Jew, is that very institution which is life-shaping, not only professionally but in terms of aspiration, in terms of values. And it seems to me that over and above investing in the list that you have here, the investment needs to be in reshaping the university as an institution. For example, you have in the United States a new university called the University of Austin in Texas. It's not the University of Texas, Austin, but it's a reaction to what's going on, the outrageous things which are going on in American, Canadian universities, and a lesser extent Australian university. And Barry Weiss, who used to be the New York Times, is involved, and so on. The diversity, equity and inclusion officers at many universities are disasters for those institutions in general and for Jewish students at those institutions. there's also all sorts of litigation that's going on. I think it's called Title IX under the American Education Act or something, where instances of discrimination against Jews are taken to and the Federal Department of Education gets involved. Now the focus is not on Jewish students in particular, it's on reshaping an institution which has basically delegitimated what its essential function should be, or one of its essential functions, and that is to foster respectful debate amongst people who have a difference of opinion. Now that's gone out the window, so I'd suggest to you that arguably way up on the top of this list that you have here should be the Jewish community's investment in reshaping reshaping colleges and universities and their culture.
Stephen, thank you for coming. We've been following your stuff for years, and it's great to be in your presence. I'm going to throw out two incendiary words, but it's part of the conversation which we haven't mentioned. And these are, I don't mean them personally, but I mean as kind of a category. Conveniently, I'll say Bibi and Trump. Okay? This isn't necessarily the individuals, but there are phenomena going on in both places and not in other parts of the world as well, which is a radicalization. And even the whole question that was just raised about the possibility of having dialogue with somebody is, when I speak to my sister in America, how do I not talk about what I want to talk about? All kinds of things. And I think many of us have been through that experience as well, trying to avoid all kinds of obvious things. That also affects the conversation, because the nature of conversations, the nature of radicalizations, and how these things are. I do a lot of stuff with Soviet Jews. Things you describe is old Bolshevik stuff. That's old Soviet propaganda about putting the Jews out and kicking the Jews out, and already with Zionism is racism. So how does this all fit in? I don't expect you to give me the answer now, but how does this fit in the context of a huge different conversation that's going on? I just put it here. Even those of us that are going between, whether it's for sake of Bibi or Gantz, or whatever it is, however it goes back, we have an existential belief in where we stay. We believe in this place. We believe in the United States, Eretz Yisrael, that's our home. For somebody who's far away, who doesn't quite believe that, what will sustain them? And it's going to be more than discussion. It's going to be more than JCRCs. There's a whole different level of. I'll even throw out, you'll forgive me, this is going to sound really goofy, but I'll say anyway, what's Hashem's plan for all of this? I don't mean to be naive, but what's going on here on a much larger basis for the Jewish people, and I think that's part of the conversation as well.
I want to welcome Terry Hendon, who is a friend and a classmate. She had another appointment, couldn't be here until now, so welcome, Terry.
Thank you.
From HUC, she's a classmate.
The young lady behind you, she was a birthright person. She was.
I think I bring a different.
Can you just say what school you're
Oh yeah,
from?
my name's Hannah, and I also go to GW in Washington D.C. with Gabby.
Where are you
But
from?
I'm originally from Oregon, which does not have a very large Jewish population, and I didn't necessarily grow up religious. So, Birthright for me was a great opportunity to understand why Israel is really important to my peers who are more religious to me. I feel like I have a better understanding than I did prior because it didn't have that big of a connection to Israel. But I think with a lot of the people, I went with Hillel, so not with Chabad. But a lot of the people on my trip, really took agency with their connection to Judaism, and they had opportunities to get bat and bar mitzvah during Birthright. And I think it was very special for a lot of people who don't necessarily grow up in areas where they have the opportunity to connect with other Jewish students. So I think it is a really good thing for people who don't have the opportunity growing up to connect with Israel and Judaism.
Shoshana.
Hi. So I made Aliyah before the rise of the IAC, the Israel American Council, and I was wondering if you could comment on the impact of the presence of the Israeli American Council, the organizing of the Israeli community within the United States, because I sense that there's a different relationship between Jewish Americans and Israelis than Jewish Americans in the state of Israel, and I don't I'm curious how you see IAC impacting those somewhat different relationships. And then I think secondary, only to echo someone else's, the presence of tech in society today and how that impacts the Jewish American experience with Israel.
The IAC has certainly made a play well into the Israel American community, meaning large numbers of folks identify with it and some of its initiatives. Their conferences have drawn significantly large numbers. They have developed in various parts of the country where there are significant cohorts of Israelis living. Institutional structures, including in West Valley of the San Fernando Valley, a JCC. They've created other ways by which they are educating and engaging Israelis to sort of keep them connected to the state. Yes. The difficulty here has been, though, that they have not been able to cross-fertilize with the rest of the organized Jewish communities, meaning they continue to sort of operate as an outsider, and many Israelis living in the United States sort of still frame their thinking in that context, and that has been, I think, amongst the major challenges that the larger community sees. Part of it is also as a kind of pushback on the part of some American Jews who say, "Why are they here?" You know, the whole idea is that if they wanted a Jewish state, so they should be living in that Jewish state. That kind of notion. I think there, no doubt, have been quite effective in at least building internally that infrastructure. Yeah. Technology, and I don't know enough about the field to know how it's impacting the Jewish community. No doubt, every day one sees materials coming out of Israel of new inventions or creations having to do with medical service or security matters or in other disciplines that affect the lives of people living in countries all over the world. And the question is how that plays out in the thinking about Israel as against the outcome of these particular successes or breakthroughs in technology and innovation. And I just don't know how to measure that implication, but I'm certain.
Which also is connected to social media.
Yes.
Some of my friends, like Artie, are much more active in the social media field vis-a-vis Israel, but there that has an impact too, no doubt.
Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment as far as Zionist education is concerned. I mean, I come from I went to Orthodox schools, I went to some conservative schools in America, and we got a certain curriculum in high school that was very nice, very Zionistic, started in 1891, very nice, but there's a huge chunk missing there, I think, for most American Jews, and maybe for all Jews, anyone who puts arts, is understanding the Middle East in of itself, how it works, the fact that we have like 50 different ethnic groups between, Middle East, North Africa, and that Arab nationalism became the default, what was acceptable here, as opposed to many different ethnic groups. And as our friend Pinchas Imbari, who's an Arab affairs expert here, he said the Middle East was minumal. It was like leopard spotted with different ethnic groups. And what Arab nationalism did, or what Islamic nationalism still tries to do, Islamism, is to paint everything in one color, red, green, but not the way it is, which is all spotted. If American Jews and Jews in Chutzlaretz in general do not understand the deep roots, meaning not even 100 to 200 years ago, I'm talking about 500 years ago, the Ottoman Empire, I'm talking about the Arab conquest, if they don't understand the deeper history of the Middle East, they will never understand how Israel might fit into that, and how perhaps instead of having 23 Arab states, we should have had 50 states or confederations or different forms of government. And that in of itself, the fact that they can't be critical because they don't understand how the Middle East works, and they kind of project their American
Do
experience,
Israelis
melting pot.
understand that?
What?
Do Israelis understand that?
Exactly, Israelis don't understand that either, but maybe they do a little bit more. Maybe a little bit more. You're right, Israelis don't understand that either. No.
That is the State Department.
Nobody understands it. So the idea is to give them a little bit of a deeper education. That should be part of the Zionist education that they receive, not just Israel's so great, because the whole Israel's so great thing, you start with the first Aliyah, that's exactly going to play into the colonialism.
Yeah.
So, and that's exactly what he was saying before about the university. That's exactly the brainwashing they're going to get there. So, it's not a healthy thing.
Dan.
Yeah, I think that what we try to do at the Jerusalem Center for the last 20 years, dealing with this issue, not in the way that Professor Elazar, unfortunately, handled it, is that I think that's a tremendous approach. But today, the United States Jewish community is faced with a refrain. If you go on to any college campus today, except for the University of Chicago, perhaps, and for Hillsdale College.
Forgot Yeshiva University.
But if you go onto my alma mater, Harvard University, Israel is defined by the following refrain, largely: from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, besides the fact that most people do not understand really what that means, other than that it's a cute refrain that you go to Harvard Yard and sing, which really calls for the destruction of the state of Israel as we know it today. The idea that Israel is an apartheid entity is not even a question on our university campuses. It's a mainstream concept. And that mainstream concept is being powered by the intersection of two progressive communities. One is the Jewish community, the Jewish progressive community, that believes deeply, with the help of the rabbinical establishment, many of which in the Reform movement, that Israel really does not have the right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people in a particular sense. And it is also being driven by a very powerful and influential Palestinian expat, intellectual, academic community that has, and this is a subject for study, Professor Magdisi at UCLA, Hatem Bazian, the head of the Students for Justice in Palestine, American Muslims for Palestine. And there are scores, Sab Arakat's Nice. There are scores of Palestinian expat, very talented professors that came out of the tradition of Edward Said and Rashid Khalidi and Joseph Mossad. And they are poisoning the environment in the universities, which is a key environment for Jewish and Israeli and Zionist education. And the other very unfortunate development, I can only say it through this story. You know, in 2019, the Bundestag, the German parliament, passed a resolution condemning the BDS movement as being anti-Semitic. There were only two major audiences that condemned the German Bundestag. One was the Hamas, and the other were 250 Israeli and Jewish academics who basically condemned in a letter the German Bundestag for daring to brand the BDS movement as anti-Semitic as it is, because it's an eraser movement. It's not a movement of correction. So you have these colliding phenomena today that we didn't have the 1980s or 70s or 60s. Israel was considered a virtuous country. There was I remember discussions about borders here and there, 67, not 67, the Olin plan, but today the discussion is completely different. And I would say, just by saying this, my friend and former classmate Jeremy Benamy from J Street has organizationally completely redefined the conversation from when I served as Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress about 12 years ago. And because today, J Street, which is really, I think, in a way challenged and maybe taken over AIPAC as an organizational, political organizational, or diplomatic organizational group, basically determines what policy should be for the state of Israel, as opposed to unconditionally supporting this whatever sitting government there is in the state of Israel, which I was told by Ambassador Lauder is what we do at the World Jewish Congress, and I think AJC, is they respect the sitting government, whatever it is, of the state of Israel. And then and so that has been completely uprooted. So I think these phenomena have a tremendous effect on the conversation going on in the United States.
All right, Chaverim, I wish we had another 2 hours, 2 days, 2 months, 2 years to sit here and really drill down into some of these very important and serious issues. We don't. I want to thank Stephen for you taking the time to be here.